Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior power platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Welcome everyone to this week's Friday learning session. This week's session is a continuation of our PL-200 multi-part series, and this week we're going to be looking at some of the offerings that Power Apps gives us within kind of the Power Platform space. More specifically, we're going to be looking at Canvas and model-driven apps this time. This is going to be a two-part section for Power Apps offerings. That being, today we're going to look at Canvas app and model-driven apps, and next week we'll be looking at Power Pages and all the functionality that brings with it, because this section is quite large when it comes to kind of the PL-200 content. There's a lot to cover, and there's a lot of demos to kind of give, so I have a tendency to split these sections up. So as usual, we'll go for our agenda. First things first, we have our introduction. That's where we are now. Hi. So for those of you who obviously haven't attended before, or for those of you watching the recording, my name is Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I have been a senior Power Platform developer for the past 4 years, working for the past year at Vantage 365. And essentially, I am also known as Power Nerd Insights. I do these sessions once a week on a Friday to kind of give people the opportunity to learn and to, give people that place to ask questions. So, the agenda for the day. Obviously, I mentioned that we're going to be looking at Canvas apps and model-driven apps. We are actually going to break that out into subsections. So when we look at Canvas apps, we're going to be looking today at different ways to create them, because there are, I think, around about 4 different ways. How we connect them to different data sources, so that's things like Dataverse, SharePoint, SQL. How we customize Canvas apps to be able to apply business logic, so we're going to be looking at a little bit of Power FX work there. And then we're also going to look at Power Apps Cards, which is a part of Canvas Apps, has a very similar kind of feel to Canvas Apps, but actually works entirely differently. And they can actually be really powerful for little things, which we'll show a bit later. After we've covered those sections of Canvas apps, we'll move into the model-driven app space, where we'll be looking at how model-driven apps are put together, how we add pages, how we customize things like views, forms, and charts within model-driven apps, how we use components within model-driven apps, and if any of you were here for my session on some of the more useful components in model-driven apps that's previously been done, you'll know that we've covered this before, but we're going to be looking at it specifically some of the really common ones like subgrids and others. And then we're also going to look at how we edit the modern command bar in terms of how we add commands in, how we might change the visibility of some of them, and how we work with that command bar as a whole. And then, as usual, we have a discussion section at the end where people are free to ask questions. So, with that being said, we do have our rules of engagement. So as usual, if you're watching and you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat. We'll probably look at covering that during the discussion section. And obviously, I am a firm believer, and there is no such thing as a stupid question. I say this every time. I do have a 4-year-old daughter. She tests that assumption. We haven't yet found a stupid question. And yeah, we're all here to learn. We're all here to try and pick up the best we can. So ask those questions, because if you've got it on your mind, somebody else probably does too. So with all that being said, let's launch into the first part of the Power Apps offerings kind of section of PL-200. That being the one that most people start with, Canvas apps. So essentially, what are Canvas apps? For those that haven't interacted with them before, Canvas apps are essentially a way for you to create a very easily customized user interface for users to interact with data that's within kind of your environments and kind of in on-prem in some situations, and to kind of really customize the look and feel of that application. And we'll start to see that as we kind of go through some of the topics here. So as I've said, we are looking at how we create Power Apps. So when we look at how we create Power Apps, let's start with that, because that's one of the key things that we need to know. So when we look at creating Power Apps, there are a few ways to do it. As you can see here, I've got my tenant set up. I've got a nice environment, but now I want to start creating Canvas apps. So there's a few ways that we can do that. So the very first one being kind of start with data space. Now, starting with data means that we can select from existing data and use that to create a Canvas app really quickly. So you can see here we've got create new tables, which takes us into one of our into what is now using natural language processing. We'll see that in a few minutes. We've got select existing tables, which deals with Dataverse tables, and then we've got connect to external data. So if I hit select existing tables, we'll use Dataverse as the option for this. And let's say I want to create an app that looks at, let's say, I'm going to take a look at some of these tables here. So let's go for something like GEF categories. What this is going to do, using that start with data option, is going to very quickly put us together an app that is interactable and is able to do some of the more basic functions with the data that we have given it. So this is things like being able to create a new item in that list, being able to read items in that list, update items, and delete items here. So you can see very quickly it's put together kind of what we've got, and it basically gives you a single screen app that gives you the create, read, update, and delete functionality for that table. So I can come in here, I can hit edit, and then I'm able to edit what I need to do. So that is our create from data. It's one of our simplest options there. Okay, takes a single table, builds an app that gives us create, read, update, and delete functionality on that table in a kind of very quickly built together app. We do have other functions in there. So in terms of creating a new app, so when we're on this home screen, one of the things that we do have available to us is this start with a page design. Now, start with a page design is essentially pre-made templates that don't have data in them. So you then have to connect it to a data source. So when I hit start with a page design, you've got things like gallery connected to a table, blank page with navigation, view and form, few little bits here. These will basically put controls on the page for you. And what it does with in the kind of modern view of things, it will tell you what data sources you could add to it. So we see here gallery connected to a table, looks at Dataverse, gallery connected to external data because SharePoint, Excel, and SQL to a degree are classed as external data sources because they don't sit within Dataverse. You click on that, and then it turns around and says, hey, we're going to guide you through connecting your data here. So when I said about obviously starting from page design, we've selected our page design. Now we identify what data we want to add. So here I'm going to hit against SharePoint. I'm going to go for the answers list there. I'm going to hit create. And then what we're going to see, again, very similar to the start with data option, is we're going to see an app get put together that looks and feels pretty much the same as the app we used the start with data option, which gives us the create, read, write, and update functionality on a single page. So both ways of achieving essentially the same outcome with a single list. Okay. Then the other option that we have on the front page. So when we go back, the other option that we have is starting with an app template. Now, starting with an app template is slightly different. App templates are to some degree fully working applications that have predefined connectors, but no defined connection to data in your tenant. This then means that they have to be configured. So when we're looking at start with an app template, you've got things like data-centered mobile apps. That's going to work very similar to when we hit start with data. But we have these other app templates down here. So we have things like Power Apps Training for Office, Shoutouts, or a service desk. If I click on Service Desk, it's going to ask me for an app name and a format. And unlike the other options, it's not going to ask me for any data sources. It's not going to be building this around an existing SharePoint list or Dataverse table. It's essentially going to build what it's got on the screen there in terms of its app template. So while we wait for that to run through, you can see there it's produced everything, and then we get this nice little yellow bar up the top where it looks like it's asking us, hey, you want to connect to data storage. So if you click make my own app, it's going to say, hey, you want to connect to OneDrive for this. You then choose the data stores that are used to sort and manage this app. It's a very quick way of kind of coming through and seeing how a app might be put together. So for instance, from a learning perspective, you can obviously click on things like this control here, which is a gallery. You can see how it might be filtered. You can also then click on things like the subparts of the gallery and see what's happening in onSelect. But that's how we essentially create an app using the app template functionality. Now, there are a few other options that we have available to us, and one of the kind of, I say newer ones, it's been around for a while, is this nice box up here, which is essentially Power Apps Copilot, where you can use everyday language, your kind of natural language processing, to generate you an application. So I could put in here, I would like an app to track my fitness goals as an option. I hit enter, and what will happen is it'll say we're setting up your app and the data behind it. We'll get this for anywhere between a few seconds. I've seen it up to I think around about 2 minutes. But what it'll do is it'll essentially produce a entity relationship diagram for you, which identifies the tables that are going to be used in your application. So this is a relatively new thing. This is an entity relationship diagram that defines tables that it has decided to build, and then other tables that it believes should be included. Now, at this stage of the kind of application build using the natural language processing, you can then query it using Copilot to add columns, add tables, establish relationships, and things like that. But obviously, for the purposes of today, what we're going to do is we're going to just hit Save and Open App because it's defined my data structures. I can look at those. I can see, yep, it's done a brilliant job. Not a problem. We save and open. And what it'll then do is build an application on top of those tables that it has defined in that entity relationship diagram. Again, a lot of these are very, very quick ways of kind of putting together an app in a quick manner based upon the data that we have. So while we wait for that to load, this one does take a bit of time just purely because it is actually building in a little bit more complexity in the app a lot of the times. So you can see there, it's added my data source, the data source that it's just created. Worthwhile noting, if you do use this functionality and you do it kind of via the home page, any of the tables or the items that it creates when building this application will not have a publisher prefix. They'll have the default publisher prefix. So you can see there mine is CR9CD for this environment. But unlike the other kind of ways of creating the application that we've seen, we can see that it's created multiple screens. It doesn't just create a single screen app that gives us create, read, update, and delete functionality on a single table. It's dealt with when we look at data, adding in our kind of data tables in there, and it's created our screens first. And if I click on those screens, I'm then able to see kind of who's where, who's done what. So we can see we've got example data kind of dropped in there as well. One thing worth noting though, obviously, when we looked at the Dataverse functionality in the last session, we identified that there were a number of tables in there that were standard. The users table is a standard table. It's worthwhile noting that when you're using the natural language processing, if you're using it to build an application from the start, and you feel like you might have to use the users table, don't use the generated users table that natural language processing gives you. Remove that, and then what you end up having to do is add an existing table and using the standard users table. Okay, but that being said, when we look at obviously how complex this works and how much it does compared to the other options, it is a lot better. Um, Now, personally, I am a bit old school. I tend not to use these. The other options that we have available to us are in the create step. So I can choose a blank app, and then it's going to say blank canvas app. That's the one that would create a blank canvas app, and that would just be a single blank screen, as I'm used to starting from. The other options that are present in this create section are image and Figma. I'm going to discuss these two as if they were the same. So image and Figma uses kind of AI to review an image or a Figma design kit file that you feed into the into the solution to decide on what controls are supposed to be on the screen. And it purely does that what controls supposed to be on the screen. It doesn't so much look at what functionality is in there. So it'll try to place the controls for you. Um, I would have an example of this, but I do not have a mocked up image. But if anybody would like to give it a try and feedback, we'd be more than happy. I think when these first released, I tried the Figma one and it kind of had a bit of a break in it, but it's still there, so I would like to see it function. Okay, so those are all the different ways that we can create an app. As you can see, there's a few ways to do it, and this is a very common theme across the Power Platform, especially in Power Apps. There's multiple different ways to achieve the same outcome or a similar outcome. So a lot of the time, it's about choosing what the kind of way you prefer to do it is and how you prefer to start. But when we looked at obviously how these apps were created, a few of them didn't have a connection to data. So when it comes to the PL-200, we have to understand how we deal with Canvas apps, how we would start to kind of connect them to data and then customize that from there. So that brings us on to our next point, which is how do we connect to data? Well, for kind of an element of wider awareness, everything that we do in kind of Canvas apps and Power Automate is done through connectors, right? Now, Power Platform has over 900 connectors and the ability to find custom connectors for you to add your own ones. That means that we have over 900 different kind of potential actions or 900 different potential um, kind of API calls that we can use to do things. However, when we're connecting to data, some of those connectors deal with that connection to data. So these are connectors like the Dataverse connector, the SharePoint connector, the Excel connector, and our SQL connectors, right? But we need to know how we add those into a Canvas app. So to add those into a Canvas app, it's actually relatively easy. So I have a blank Canvas app here. So this is one I started from blank. And then what we end up having to do is to connect to data. We come over to the left, this data tab over here, and very simply, we hit add data. Now, what you'll see is you'll get a nice little list here. So you'll see tables in your current environment. These are all Dataverse tables that are in your current environment. You have the option for AI models to bring those in. And then we have the option for other connectors. So I mentioned about these 900 plus connectors, right? So we can bring in things like Excel Online Business data. We can bring in Microsoft Teams data, Office 365 users data, OneDrive data, Planner data, all this information. What we need to do is find where the data we're trying to access is stored, search for the connector. For the purpose of this, I'm going to choose SharePoint. And then we choose a connection. If you don't have one, you hit add a connection, it'll create one. And then you choose a site and you choose the list that you want to bring in. So I'm going to bring in answers, Bob, and let's say equipment. And there we go. I've added external data, technically SharePoint data, into my app. And that means it's now accessible if I go to a vertical gallery. Hmm. Okay then. Looks like live demos are having a bit of an issue. Let's give it a refresh and see what we can pull in. There we go. Everything's loaded. There we go. So we'll see as that data starts to be loaded in, we start to get the lists appear and you can see that the data source has been added. So we've added the data source. Well, we now need to access it. So like I said, let's drop a gallery in and let's look at some of these lists. So when you want to select a data source for a control, this happens a lot with galleries. That's why I'm using this as an example. You can essentially just in your app section, click answers, and what will happen is your gallery will update. Let's say I wanted to insert another gallery that looked at, let's say, equipment. Click on equipment, and then it updates to show all the records in that list. Now, if I went to that list, you can see there that it's all sat in there. This, when you add a data source, this doesn't mean that it's basically being brought in as a copy. This is a connection that is live to that specific list. So it's hosted in SharePoint and then surfaced in Canvas apps. If we were to connect to other data sources, such as Dataverse, you can see here I can just choose accounts. Similar situation, we hit add data, we find the table, we click on it, and then it adds it in. Very, very simple, as we can see, to add data in a Canvas app. So when we look at, obviously, what our Canvas apps are supposed to be used for, I said at the start that they are essentially a way to provide a very pleasant and highly customizable user interface to the data that we hold within kind of our business. Now, that's all well and good. We can connect to our data. We can kind of view it, but a lot of the time we want to do something with it. We want to apply some level of business logic to it. We want to do some error handling on things like forms, or we want to show more data. We want to be able to edit things. Well, when we look at how we customize Canvas app to apply business logic, this is all done through something called PowerFX, which is essentially the language that runs Canvas apps, and is also present now in model-driven apps, and is even in the modern command, but even the modern command bar editor, we can use PowerFX. So it's quite a prevalent language across the whole of the platform. So when we're looking at, obviously, customizing our Canvas apps to apply business logic, we need to think of PowerFX. But what does that mean? Well, when we come to Canvas apps, so let's say I come to my Canvas app that I've just created. Let's say when I select an item from this gallery here, I want to be able to set a variable that stores the, let's say, the name of the item. So I'd use the PowerFX formula bar that you can see up here, and I would write PowerFX to be able to induce that. Now, PowerFX has a load of functions, and if I were to recommend one place to view those all, there is a blog by a gentleman called Matthew Devaney, who has a Power Apps functions list. Very clear, very simple, and it's something I will add the link to in the chat here, but also in the YouTube kind of description. But we use PowerFX essentially to define that business logic. So I can say GBL text name, and I'm going to call it this item dot, let's say, title or name. And let's say, great, I've clicked that button. I now want to display that name in a text label. Again, very simple. We add our control. We come into the text label. We find the text property, and we go GBL text item name. Now, obviously, right now, there's nothing selected. But if I were to preview the app and hit that, or hit that, or hit that, and this doesn't just obviously work in terms of text. There's other things you can do. So there's things like we can add conditional logic. So I can test whether the item name equals, let's say, HP Pavilion 24. And then if it is, let's say we wanted to basically tell the user that this was no longer available. So we can go, let's have a look at this. If it equals HP Pavilion 24, let's go GBL text item name. So we're going to use that variable again. And then we're going to go, we're going to use a double ampersand, which means and then hyphen not available. So right there, we've basically run a conditional statement. see, there's me miswriting my business logic. That's because I've put an ampersand and not the function I should have used, which was concatenate. There we go. So you can see there, I've introduced an element of conditional logic, which basically turns around and says, hey, test this thing. If it returns as true, do something else. PowerFX has a lot of functions, but it is the core way of us implementing business logic within our Canvas apps. The more and more you use it, the more and more familiar you'll become with it. And what I would recommend for the kind of PL-200 space is if you have the opportunity to dive into building a Canvas app. Obviously, we have the Power Apps Challenge here as a way to facilitate that, to give real world challenges to obviously have people build these things and develop these skills. But we also have the community here to ask questions. There are a lot of functions out there. If I were to cover them all in this session, we'd be here for a good 3 hours. But obviously, in terms of the objective that we have for this session, we're looking at how do we customize Canvas apps to apply business logic. The answer is use PowerFX, use functions, use conditional logic, use all the tools at your disposal within PowerFX. Use the PowerFX functions because you can apply business logic using that. So we now move on to Power Apps cards. Well, this is interesting. This is not something that very many people have used. But Power Apps Cards is essentially a simplified version of Canvas apps that enables you to create very simple kind of put together cards is the best way I can use it. Probably not the best language, but um, little apps that require very little user interaction. That are designed to be shared in teams that require minimal code and dev work, but can still connect with enterprise data and use PowerFX. So how do we get to them? Well, that's relatively easy. So when we look at Power Apps, it's not something that is available to us on the home page, as you can see. But if you come to create and you scroll down a bit, we've got this cards option here. If you click on that, you can end up in this view and you basically request to create a card. You can see I've got two. And here's one I've made earlier. As you can see, it's very different in terms of the Canvas app kind of structure. There's very much reduced down properties on the items available. We do have a tree view in terms of what's in there, but we have very few options when it comes to things like text labels. If I were to compare the properties that we have available in Canvas apps on a text label to the properties we have available to us in a card. Aha. Thank you, Ladigno. There we go. So, as I was saying, how do we get to cards? We'll start from there. So, as you can see on the home page of Power Apps, you don't have an option there. If you hit create and you scroll down slightly, you have the cards option here. Perfect. As you can see, when you click into it, it's an entirely different interface. It lists different items, but we have the cards that you have available to you and all cards. You can see I've got two here. And if I were to create a new card, I'd end up in a display like this. Now, as you can see, it looks very different to how the actual Canvas App Studio looks, because this is the Cards Studio. You can see in the top left we have very limited options. I've only got the option to change between viewing the card in either Microsoft Teams Dark Mode and Light Mode. And I have a very few options in terms of the controls that I can input on the actual card itself. If we look at the properties over on the right, so I've currently got a text label selected. If I look at the text label properties that I have available to me in the Canvas app display, I've got a lot more than what I have in the cards display. This is because cards is designed to work completely differently. So from that perspective, when should we really use cards? This is something to understand, especially for the PL-200. So some of your common use case scenarios for looking at cards, when you want to gather a list of idea submissions from users in a Teams channel, when you're running a poll on a topic specific to a team in a Teams channel, when you're providing a review and approval process for invoices, that's where it's used. Fun little tip: the approvals connector makes use of cards to send the approvals card in Teams. And kind of you can see that using these use cases, a lot of it is geared toward Teams. And I kind of hinted at it by looking at the view option up here, that the only option I have is to change from Microsoft Teams Dark to Microsoft Teams Light. That is because cards are designed to be sent in Teams. Simple as that. They're not really designed for much else. You can connect to data. So if I come here and I hit add data, you'll see that I only have four options, not the same amount of connector options I had in the Canvas app. That's because these are the options that are available to be accessed while the card is placed in Teams. So you can only really use Microsoft Dataverse data in here in terms of business record data, but you can use Office 365 users, Outlook, and Groups connectors as well to feed data in. Um, Obviously, when I look at the Office 365 Groups connector, uh, I have a broken connection, so I'll need to fix that one moment. Okay, so when I click on that, it's adding data in the exact same way, but now I've got access to this. So using that, I can use the PowerFX formula bar and go, let's see, and then we're going to put in here. So you can use PowerFX formulas, but one of the limitations of the controls itself, obviously when we're looking at limitations, I did note the one about you can only update Dataverse records, or you can only use Dataverse records as a kind of data source. However, um, when you're looking at using a card, you can actually only update Dataverse records. You can't create or delete Dataverse records from a card. Um, the PowerFX expressions that we do have available to us are limited, and obviously the biggest limitation, these cards can only be shared in Teams. Now, when we look at this, I'm just going to put there, and we're going to say Office 365 groups dot, let's so list groups first. So this is again an element of business logic that can be used. Dot value. Now, when we look at that, that's going to basically throw a fit because that's not a table. Yeah, as you can see, you're able to then create kind of items using the card. You fill it in, and then you hit essentially share or play. So I choose play, save and play. And then we have the send option. So you hit send in Teams or send from a flow. When you look at the sending in Teams, it's essentially just copy the URL and paste it in. But that is cards. Now, when we look at obviously Canvas apps, that's pretty much everything we have in terms of Canvas apps. We have the ability to obviously create UI, and obviously what I've shown there is a very basic view of kind of how we drag Canvas apps in. Canvas apps can look absolutely stunning, and the major use case for them is that kind of very pleasant user interface where we might want to guide a customer, or let's say someone operating through a business process through. Really good example of this is if you would use a Canvas app to build a ticketing system for your end users to be able to submit tickets to the iHub staff or the IT team staff. When we look at that, obviously the admin side would probably be something a bit more data intensive and heavy, which is actually a very good pivot onto our next topic, which is model driven apps. So um, if you've not had much experience with Dataverse, you probably wouldn't have seen model-driven apps. But I'm obviously going to give a quick show through today. But the first thing to know is what are model-driven apps? Well, they're essentially a data-driven application that's based on Dataverse that focuses more on the admin side and the data processing side rather than the kind of user interface. Pretty much every single model-driven app kind of has the same structure and look, which I'll identify today, and the same way of kind of building them. But one thing to note is that the data model that sits behind your model-driven app is massively key. So if you don't have your Dataverse tables and your relationships set up in the right way, your model-driven app won't work as well as it should do. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through essentially adding how you add pages to a model-driven app, how you customize the views, forms, and charts that appear in a model-driven app, how we use those components that we most commonly use in model-driven apps, how we add them to a form, and then we're going to look at editing the command bar as well, because these are all things that will be looked at on the PL-200. So, with that being said, what does a model-driven app look like? Well, model-driven apps look very, very different to your Canvas apps. So I'm going to show you an example of a model-driven app that's been completely customized and has had a lot done to it. And then we're going to go through how we might create a model-driven app. Okay. So what's loading up now is a model-driven app. As I said, model-driven apps are very kind of admin-based and kind of data intensive in terms of what they show. There we go. So this is a model-driven app. So as mentioned that they all have a relatively similar structure. That structure being that there is a navigation menu on the left-hand side. There is a command bar at the top which allows you to perform functions with either the table or with selected records. And then you have a data view kind of in the middle. You can select records from the data view, and then you can see things where you can edit items, you can see kind of fields, and click through certain parts of it. Now, obviously, this model-driven app has, as I said, been heavily customized. There are different components that we have on here, so I'm pretty sure that this one is a grid and basically is the Power Apps edit grid, I believe. Um, so you can see that that looks slightly different. A brand new model-driven app will look completely different to this in terms of the data view. The navigation bar will still be there. The command bar will still be there, but a lot of the customization on a model-driven app affects this area first. But before we get to that customization, we actually need to be able to build a model-driven app. So how do we do that? Well, as I said, a model-driven app is based on Dataverse tables. So the first thing we need to have is Dataverse tables. So I'm going to look at CRBT bookings, fault logging, and rooms as an option. Um, I'm going to come into create and I'm going to hit blank app, and then we have blank app based on Dataverse. So if I create that, I can give this a name. Let's go CRBT booking management, and then hit create. So this is an entirely new model-driven app. And as you can see, it's gotten to from that create option and then hitting blank and then choosing the model-driven app option. And what we get is the model-driven app creator in terms of the editor. Now this looks entirely different to obviously Canvas apps. As I said, model-driven apps are very much data-driven. So we actually need to start by adding a page for navigation. And what it means by adding a page is essentially adding data. So one of our very first things is how we add pages. So if I hit add page for now, you can see here I have an option around what page I add. We have Dataverse tables. This is as it sounds. You add a Dataverse table as a navigation on there. We have dashboard, which is something you configure to take charts from multiple areas. You can also, if you select dashboard, choose some system dashboards that are already in there, but essentially that's for replacing reports that you've built into your model-driven app. You have custom page. Now, custom page is an interesting one. This is going to start to blur the lines a little bit between Canvas apps and model-driven apps, but using a custom page, you can actually embed a Canvas app onto your model-driven app. We have web resources, which allows us to basically target web resource files. So you can see I've got a URL there. and a load of other HTML files, so I can use HTML files to target that and then put them in new sub areas. And then the other option we have is a navigation link. Now, when I add a navigation link, I'm just going to show it here because this one's relatively simple. Add. What I'm going to get is this nice little button here, and I click that, and the preview mode doesn't support URLs, but essentially that would take me to Google. So that's a navigation element. Now, in terms of what we want to do today, and in terms of the PL-200, what we're going to focus on is adding the Dataverse table page. So from here, I can select a table. I'm going to select a few of them. I'm going to select bookings, rooms, and fault logging. And then you can see there, we now have a model-driven app that shows me the bookings, the fault loggings, and the rooms. And very quickly, I can see what's in there and a view that's already been configured. But that is adding pages. Now, some of these views are already customized because these are tables that I have used previously. But you can see over on the left-hand side, we have bookings view, bookings form, fault loggings view, fault loggings form, rooms view, and rooms form. And if you remember when we looked at obviously what we were learning today, part of that is customizing views, forms, and charts for a table. So we're actually going to start covering that now. This is where we start to get into customizing model-driven apps. So we've now added our data, we've added our pages, which is all well and good. We now need to make it look how we want it to look, and that's done through configuring those views, forms, and charts. So we'll start with the view. When we look at the views, we can choose here CRBT bookings view, hit the edit view, little pencil icon that normally appears to the right, and then it is as simple to configure a view as dragging and dropping a column onto the view. Now, if I hit save and publish, what I'm going to have happen is in my model-driven app, once it saves and publishes, if I hit back, and I now look at CRBT bookings, you can see that the booking team notes column that I've just added in that view has now appeared in my model-driven app. It is based on the configuration of that view as to what your model-driven app looks like. We do have a few other options in terms of the views that are available to us. So you can see here that we've got a sort by option, a filter by option that you can add filters to, and then we essentially just add columns in and do what we need to do. The other thing you can do, it's worthwhile noting, if your table has a relationship to another table, you can add columns from a parent record onto a child table view. So when we look at this, we've got room booked. I could add in things like the room status just there. And it'll show up as room status, room booking. To remove them, it's as simple as right click and hit remove. Save and publish. That is configuring a view. Relatively easy, relatively simple, very much a drag and drop interface and a few clicks here and there to edit things like filters and the sort by behavior. That's all well and good. We're now able to configure how our table looks when we first come in, when we're looking for a record to edit or do something with. That works for us. Great. What happens when we want to edit that item? So when we click in, you can see here that I've got a set of records that I can look at. I can actually go in and configure a form itself. So this is where we get into configuring forms. Again, we can do it from the model-driven app. We click on the form, hit save and continue. And again, very, very similar to kind of the views kind of with customizing a form. If we want to add additional fields onto here, we can pull booking building on and it'll do what it needs to do. But when it comes to kind of dealing with forms, we do have a number of other functionalities in here. So we have an option for business rules. This is something that we covered with Dataverse, and in terms of looking at Dataverse, we have the ability to define new business rules from here as well. These can change the visibility of fields on the form, the requirements of fields on the form, and a number of other things. The other thing that we have kind of in here is JavaScript form libraries. So this gets more into the realm of the kind of PL-400 course, but JavaScript form libraries are essentially a way you can execute client-side script based upon data changes to fields against forms. We have the ability to look at obviously the tree view. We all know what this looks like. We have the fields, and then we have this option called components here. Now, one of the things that we can do with components is essentially change how the form looks and works. So we have the ability to add things like one column tabs, which means that now I can separate my information out into a new tab and drag these fields that we've got onto that new tab section there and have it do what I want it to do. And let's call this, rename the tab so we can select items and just call this random information. Then hit save and publish. But essentially, these components change how the form is structured. Some of them will change what information appears on the form. Some of them will allow us to add in kind of reference to child and parent items. So we've got a subgrid option here. We can drag those on, customize them, and other bits as well. And then over on the right hand side here, we have a properties pane that allows us to kind of work with certain fields or the form as a whole. Um, and then we also have this events tab, which essentially allows us to define onload and on-change events for fields, onload events or on save events for the form to then trigger client-side script. But that is customizing our forms. We then have charts. Now, charts are something different. To be able to customize a chart, you have to select a table in your model-driven app, come to charts, and then hit new chart. And what you'll get is the chart creator view, which does take a little bit to load. So as you can see, this is the chart designer. It turns up in the classic view. This is something we did cover in the Dataverse Basics course. But we can choose to add different types of charts. So I can add a column chart, which we've got there, and I can call this, let's say, bookings per room. And then I select a field. Let's go CBRT bookings, count all, and then we turn around and on the horizontal we go, let's say, location. And then that's going to generate a chart for me to be able to look at. Save on that. Very, very much similar to if you've used Excel charts, being able to do that. But what it means is you can then add charts onto your form and kind of go from there. Now, he says as he hits save, we should hit save and close. So you see there, I've got a bookings chart there. So in terms of obviously editing those charts, it is very, very simple. But yeah, that is essentially customizing views, forms, and charts. When we looked at obviously the pages section, I did mention about the dashboard. We can choose to add in things like the assets over time dashboard, which then basically puts information out there in terms of a collection of charts put together. Yeah, that is that. Now, when we're looking at that, you can see that the ability to create a model-driven app in terms of one that performs the function It's a lot quicker if you've got your data model correct from the start, and it's a lot quicker to produce that model-driven app to a proof of concept or even a minimum viable product than it would be to do that for Canvas apps. So, looking at obviously our kind of objectives, we're only kind of two into the model-driven app space, but you can see how quickly we can put something together off the back of a data structure and make it work. One of the things that we can do to kind of bring the user interface up a level is something I did show in the kind of fully fleshed out model-driven app I demoed, which is use components to change how certain things look. So when we look at that, we actually have the option for in things like let's go CRBT rooms. If I look at the form here, we have the option to do things like from the components tab, add in something called a subgrid. This is a very, very commonly used component. We drop it in, and then we can say, hey, I want you to only show related records for this room, and I want you to show all the faults that have been logged, right? Live reported faults. If I hit done on that, what that's going to do is if I were to load up a room record and it had faults logged against it, oh, there we go. So, just to rehash, in terms of obviously, we're currently editing a form. We go to the components tab, bring subgrid across, and then we show related records, and we can go CRBT fault lookings, live reported faults. So this subgrid is a very commonly used component that's designed to essentially show related records or child records on a form from a parent record. So let's say I had room that had 50 faults logged against it. What I don't want to be doing is going into, let's say, that parent record and going, that's the room, right? I want to see all the faults related to that room. I don't want to have to search through the fault table for that specific room name appearing multiple times, right? This subgrid allows us to do that. And essentially, this is a component. We configure the properties over here. We kind of choose a table. We choose a view on that table. We can add charts as well, a few other bits as and bits like that. But you can see down here it has components. Now, if I add component, I can turn around and say, hey, I've added a subgrid in there. I now want this to be a Power Apps grid control. And then I can configure that Power Apps grid control to do certain things. These components essentially allow us to change how things work and how things are viewed. Obviously, this is editing components at the form level. Okay, it's slightly different if you want to do it at a view level. If you want to add components to a view like I had done in the model-driven app I'd shown before, you have to go through the classic editor to do that. But essentially, the way to do that is to come to the little cog icon top right, hit Advanced Settings, which will take you into the classic view. Go to Customizations, customize the system, and then for the table that you want to add that kind of component to in terms of its view, you see how I've got entities there. Well, actually, I want to change how the CRBT rooms entity worked. So we click on CRBT rooms, and then you come to the controls option. So it's not the component option, it's the controls option. Right now, the actual thing that is enabled that changes, that shows what the view is, or how it defines how it looks and how it works, is the read-only grid. Actually, for the purpose of this, I want to use the, let's say, the Power Apps grid control, because I've done a good session on that. I know how I should be using it. Define it there, swap it over for phone, web, phone, and tablet. So this is another thing to note. If you're doing this in terms of editing the how the view should behave, and you're doing it through this way, you can actually choose uh, what kind of device it would turn up on. So if someone tried to access your model-driven app via a phone, you could choose that they only see the read-only grid, not the Power Apps grid control. But let's say I want to enable inline editing. I'm going to choose that. And I want to, let's see, enable option set colors because option set colors make things look pretty. Hit yes on that. And then all I do is I hit save. That does what it needs to do. We close this out. We come back to our model driven app. And if I look at rooms view and give it a refresh, he says, it doesn't look as if it's turning up. Okay, for the purpose of this, we're going to have to pretend that this changed to look something very similar to what I had shown in the first place when we looked at the CRM work management solution, the model driven app that I demoed first. So essentially enabling those few little options would have changed what that was to look something like this, where we've actually got an option set that can be edited and shows all the nice little statuses and the colors against them. So very quickly, we could change how the model driven app works and how it looks. But that is using components. I'm going to pause there briefly for any questions. If there are none, we'll move into editing the command bar. Okay, so editing the command bar. I mentioned that obviously in model-driven apps, we have this command bar up at the top here, which allows us to perform actions and functions with certain records or with the view as a whole. Now, when we look at this, I have the option to obviously refresh, visualize the view, do a load of other things. But what if I wanted to edit that command bar to such a degree that actually I wanted to introduce a new command that, let's say, called a let's say edit the command bar so that it called a Power Automate flow, or it's called a, I don't know, a web resource script that I had access to. Well, that's relatively easy to do. So we do it from inside of our model driven app. We come to the little three dots on the left on the table, and then we hit edit command bar, and then we get this option here. So we have the option, because the command bar for a main grid view, a main form view, a subgrid view, and an associated view are all different, we have the option to choose. In terms of this option, that only changes where the command bar turns up. I'm going to choose main grid for now. And what we get is a very, very similar to Canvas app's view of what the buttons are. So we have our commands available to us. We have the option to create a new command or change how things work. So we can add a new drop down, and let's say actually when we look at this, I want delete to be in that drop down. They won't let me move delete, of course. So worthwhile noting, some of the kind of standard commands won't let you move them. Um, yeah, buttons read only. So a lot of these will be read only buttons. Um, there are some ones that you can hide, some ones that you can't, but essentially this is how you edit that command bar, how you add new commands in. So if I hit new command here, I can choose between using PowerFX. So I mentioned when we were looking at Canvas apps that you can use PowerFX now to define a command, or JavaScript, which is the old way of doing it. So if I choose PowerFX for the moment, what it's going to do is it's going to create a new command for me in the command bar. Appears it's taking some time. So there we go. This is my new command. All well and good. I now need to give it a name, so otherwise it's just going to turn up as a new command. Let's call this PowerFX command. I want to give it an icon. I can either use an icon that's already present, so there's quite a fair amount of them, or I can use a web resource, which is an icon that you can basically pull in. Yeah, we have the option of actions as to whether it runs formula or JavaScript. Run formula basically means you're using PowerFX to get it to do something, and run JavaScript means you're calling a web resource. You can change the visibility, whether it's always shown or whether it's on a condition. And then essentially, when you want to define what that command is for PowerFX formulas, you hit open formula bar, and right here, I'm going to put in a notify function. There we go. Very simply, I've just created a new command. If I hit save and publish, and then go back, you can see here that I've got a PowerFX command. That new command that I've just created in that command bar has appeared, and I can press it, and it should then do something. In this case, it doesn't look as if it is. It looks as if the notify function isn't working as it should do. But yeah, that is how we edit the command bar, add commands, update commands, and other bits as well. Which actually brings us to the end of the teaching part of the session. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.